In the heart of early Rome, long before emperors, marble temples, and vast armies, the city was ruled by unwritten customs and the will of powerful aristocrats. The common people, known as the plebeians, lived under laws they could not read and judgments they could not predict. Their fate often rested in the hands of magistrates who interpreted tradition as they pleased. But in the mid-5th century BCE, this struggle for fairness gave birth to one of the most important milestones in legal history. It was called the 12 Tables, Rome's first written code of law. Chapter 1: The Struggle of the Orders. The story of the 12 Tables cannot be told without first understanding the struggle of the orders, one of the most important and long-lasting social conflicts in Roman history. This struggle was not fought on battlefields with swords and shields, but in the streets, assemblies, and sacred spaces of Rome itself. It was a war of words, laws, and rights. A centuries-long conflict between the patricians, the city's aristocratic elite, and the plebeians, the common people who made up the vast majority of Roman society. At its heart, the struggle of the orders was about power, fairness, and survival. Who would control Rome's government? Who would write its laws? Who would benefit from its wealth and protection? These questions defined the early republic and pushed Rome toward one of its most significant achievements: the creation of a public, written code of law. When the Roman Republic was founded in 509 BCE, after the expulsion of the last king, power fell largely into the hands of the patricians. These were aristocratic families who claimed noble descent and held control over religious offices, political institutions, and the courts. Their authority came not just from wealth and land, but from tradition, the ancient customs of their ancestors, or mos maiorum, which guided Roman life. The plebeians, by contrast, were the farmers, artisans, laborers, and soldiers of Rome. They were free citizens, not slaves, but they lacked the privileges of the patrician class. They worked the land, served in the legions, paid taxes, and built the city, yet they had little to no say in how it was governed. The problem was not just inequality, it was uncertainty. Because Rome's laws were not written down, they existed as a body of unwritten traditions and precedents that only the patrician magistrates could interpret. To a plebeian hauled before a patrician judge, justice often seemed like an unpredictable, one-sided weapon. This imbalance of power created tension that would explode again and again over the next 2 centuries. The plebeians wanted something simple but revolutionary. They wanted laws they could see, rights they could trust, and protections against abuse. Fueling this struggle was the constant weight of debt bondage, one of the harshest realities of plebeian life. Many plebeians were small farmers who lived close to poverty. When Rome went to war, as it often did in the early republic, these men were called to serve in the legions, leaving their fields unattended. Crops failed, farms were ruined, and debts mounted. The laws of debt were brutal. A plebeian who could not repay a creditor could be seized, chained, and even sold into slavery. Families were broken, farms lost, and lives destroyed by this system of nexum, or debt slavery. Stories from Rome's earliest historians, like Livy, tell of desperate debtors who appealed to the public for justice. One famous tale describes a war veteran, scarred from battle, who showed his wounds in the forum while in chains for failing to pay his debts. The sight enraged the plebeian crowd and sparked a wave of anger against the patricians. Whether the tale is fact or legend, it captures the essence of the plebeians' grievance. They gave their lives to defend Rome, yet at home they were shackled by laws that favored the rich. By 494 BCE, the tension had reached a breaking point. Rome was at war with neighboring tribes, but the plebeians refused to fight. Instead, they staged the first secession of the plebs, withdrawing from the city and marching to a hill outside Rome. This was not a rebellion in the sense of fire and blood, but it was no less dangerous. Without plebeian soldiers, the Republic could not defend itself. The patricians, alarmed by the mass withdrawal, were forced to negotiate. The result was one of the first great victories for plebeian rights, the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs. These tribunes, elected by the plebeians, had the power to protect citizens from unjust treatment by patrician magistrates. Most importantly, they held the right of veto, the power to block laws or actions that threatened the plebeians. The establishment of the tribunate was a landmark moment. For the first time, plebeians had officials dedicated to their defense. Yet it was only the beginning. The larger issues, especially the need for a written law code, remained unresolved. The struggle between patricians and plebeians was not only political and economic, it was also religious. The patricians held a monopoly on the interpretation of sacred law, rituals, and omens. In early Rome, religion and politics were inseparable. To control the gods was to control the city. Priests, augurs, and other religious officials were almost exclusively patricians, and they could use their authority to delay or block public actions. If a plebeian assembly was about to pass a measure unfavorable to the elite, a patrician priest might suddenly declare the omens unfavorable, halting the vote. For the plebeians, this was another example of the law being hidden, manipulated, and used against them. Their struggle was not just for political equality, but for access to knowledge of laws, procedures, and even the will of the gods. As the decades passed, it became clear that the plebeians' demands were not going away. Each time their grievances were ignored, they threatened another secession, another withdrawal of labor and arms. Each time, concessions were made. But one issue loomed largest: the law itself. How could there be justice if the law was not written? How could plebeians defend themselves if they did not know the rules? The patricians resisted, arguing that written laws would weaken their authority and limit their flexibility in judgment. For them, unwritten law was a tool of power. For the plebeians, written law was nothing less than survival. They wanted clarity, transparency, and fairness. They wanted to ensure that a citizen's rights could not be taken away by the whim of a magistrate or the interpretation of an elite. The pressure built until the mid-5th century BCE, when Rome finally agreed to codify its laws. But this was not a sudden or simple decision. It was the culmination of decades of struggle, of debt crises, secessions, protests, and negotiations between the two orders. The 12 Tables, when they finally emerged, were not just a legal document. They were the product of this long fight, the struggle of the orders that reshaped the Republic. They represented a hard-won compromise, a recognition that the plebeians' demands could no longer be ignored. The struggle of the orders did not end with the 12 Tables. It continued for nearly 2 centuries, gradually eroding patrician privilege and expanding plebeian rights. By the 3rd century BCE, plebeians could hold high office, serve as priests, and share fully in Rome's political life. But the earliest phase, this battle for a written law code, was perhaps the most transformative. It marked the moment when Rome moved from a system of hidden traditions to one of public accountability. The law, once the possession of the elite, became the property of the people. And so, the stage was set. Out of struggle and sacrifice, Rome's first law code would be born. 12 bronze tablets that would stand for centuries as a symbol of fairness, order, and the rule of law. Chapter 2. The demand for written law. The struggle of the orders had shaken Rome, but it was far from finished. The creation of the office of the tribunes gave the plebeians a voice in the political system. Yet that voice could only defend, not create. The tribunes could veto laws and protect individuals from abuse, but they could not make the system itself transparent. Justice still rested in the hands of patrician magistrates, and those magistrates still relied on unwritten traditions. The plebeians were safe from sudden arrests, but they were still vulnerable to the deeper injustice of laws they could not see. As years passed, the demand for written law grew louder. Plebeians wanted more than just protection. They wanted fairness that was visible to all citizens. They wanted rules carved into stone or bronze, not whispered in the chambers of the patricians. The heart of their demand was simple: no one should be above the law, and the law should not be hidden. In the early Republic, the patricians argued against this idea. They claimed that the strength of Roman law came from its flexibility, from the wisdom of magistrates who could adapt tradition to fit each case. But in truth, this flexibility was power. If only the patricians knew the law, then only the patricians could decide what was just. For the plebeians, it was no longer acceptable to live under invisible rules. The struggle over written law became one of the defining moments of the Republic. It was not only a political conflict, but a cultural revolution. Rome was on the edge of creating something radical, something that would echo through the centuries. The pressure for reform reached a peak in the middle of the 5th century BCE. By this time, the memory of the first secession of the plebs was still fresh. The patricians knew that if the common people grew angry enough, they could withdraw again, leaving Rome defenseless. At the same time, Rome was facing pressure from its neighbors. Wars with the Aqui, the Volsci, and other Italian tribes drained the city's resources. A united Rome was necessary for survival. It was in this tense environment that the idea of writing down the laws became impossible to ignore. The plebeians insisted on it, and the patricians reluctantly agreed to a compromise. Rome would send envoys to study the laws of other nations, especially those of Greece, where written law codes had already been established. The choice of Greece was no accident. The Greek city of Athens had famously adopted the reforms of Solon in the 6th century BCE, a set of written laws that balanced the interests of rich and poor. To Roman eyes, Athens was a model of a powerful and orderly republic, and its legal traditions seemed like a path forward. By studying the Greek experience, the Romans hoped to craft their own code, one suited to their needs. A group of Roman envoys was dispatched to Greece, possibly to Athens itself, though ancient sources disagree on the details. Whether they truly reached Athens or only studied Greek colonies in southern Italy, the important point is that the Romans turned outward in search of solutions. They understood that their own customs were no longer enough. They wanted to create something lasting, something written, something that could be displayed publicly for all to see. When the envoys returned, the Roman Senate took a bold step. In 451 BCE, the Republic suspended the usual system of magistrates and appointed a special board of 10 men, known as the Decemviri. These 10 were given extraordinary power to draft the laws that would become the foundation of Roman justice. For 1 year, they held absolute authority, and even the tribunes were suspended. The creation of the Decemviri was both daring and dangerous. By giving all power to 10 men, Rome risked tyranny. But the need for a written code was urgent. The people agreed to trust the Decemviri, believing that at last their demands for justice would be met. The first Decemvirate set to work. They studied the traditions of Rome, the customs of their ancestors, and the examples from Greece. In the following year, they presented 10 bronze tablets, each inscribed with laws, to the Roman people. These tablets were displayed in the Forum, the heart of the city, where every citizen could see them. The reaction was immediate. For the first time, Rome's laws were visible. No longer could a magistrate claim ignorance or twist tradition to serve his own class. The people now had a reference point, a foundation for justice. Yet the work was not complete. The 10 tablets did not cover every matter, and some issues remained unresolved. The plebeians demanded more, and so a second board of Decemviri was appointed in 450 BCE to finish the work. The second Decemvirate produced 2 more tablets, bringing the total to 12. With these, Rome had its first complete written law code, the 12 tables, but the process had not been smooth. The second board of Decemviri abused its power, refusing to step down at the end of their term. They ruled like tyrants, sparking anger and unrest among the people. Stories tell of the infamous Decemvir Appius Claudius, who used his position to pursue a young plebeian woman named Virginia, leading to tragedy and rebellion. Whether the details are true or not, the story reflects the distrust that arose from concentrated power. Eventually, the tyranny of the second Decemvirate collapsed. The people revolted, the tribunes were restored, and the Republic returned to its normal system. But the 12 tables remained. Despite the corruption of their authors, the laws themselves stood as a permanent achievement. The 12 tables were more than just a list of rules. They were a declaration that the law belonged to the people. They set a precedent that the law should be public, not secret, and that justice must be the same for all citizens. For the plebeians, it was a victory in their long struggle. For the patricians, it was a concession that preserved social peace. For Rome as a whole, it was a foundation on which the Republic could grow. The significance of the 12 tables was profound. Every Roman child in the Republic was expected to memorize them. They were recited in schools, repeated in households, and inscribed in memory as well as in bronze. Though the original tablets were later destroyed, their words were preserved in fragments and in the writings of later authors. Cicero would later say that the 12 tables were worth more than all the libraries of philosophy, for they laid the foundation of Roman life. It is important to understand that the 12 tables were not perfect. They were harsh, reflecting the brutal realities of early Roman society. They allowed debt bondage, confirmed the authority of the father over the household, and imposed severe punishments for even minor crimes. But their strength was not in their fairness, it was in their existence. By writing the laws, Rome had taken a step no less revolutionary than the expulsion of its kings. It had declared that law was no longer the possession of the elite, but the property of the entire community. The demand for written law had been answered, and Rome would never be the same. Chapter 3. What the 12 Tables said. The 12 Tables were not a grand philosophical treatise or a visionary statement of human rights. They were practical, blunt, and at times brutally harsh. They reflected the realities of a society still rough around the edges, a city struggling with inequality, constant war, and the daily struggles of survival. Yet despite their simplicity and severity, the 12 Tables became the bedrock of Roman law. They were Rome's first attempt to put justice into writing, to create a legal framework that all citizens could see and rely upon. The laws themselves were written on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, the very heart of public life in Rome. This act was symbolic as much as it was practical. By placing the laws in the open, where every citizen could read them, the Republic sent a clear message. The rules of Rome were no longer hidden in the minds of magistrates or twisted by the interests of the elite. The law was now a public thing, visible to all. The content of the 12 Tables covered nearly every aspect of daily life. They dealt with family, property, contracts, crime, and punishment. They laid out the rights of creditors, the authority of fathers, and the penalties for theft and assault. In their words, one can see both the harshness of early Rome and the beginnings of principles that would later shape Western legal traditions. One of the most striking features of the 12 Tables was their treatment of debt. Debt was a central issue in the struggle of the orders, and the laws reflected the patricians' desire to maintain strict control over creditors and debtors. The tables allowed a creditor to seize a debtor who failed to repay if the debt remained unpaid after 30 days. The creditor could bind the debtor in chains. After 60 days, the debtor could be sold into slavery, even across the river into foreign lands. This was a harsh solution, one that kept plebeians in fear of financial ruin. And yet, it was now written down, no longer left to arbitrary decision. The laws also spoke of family. In Rome, the authority of the father, the paterfamilias, was absolute. The 12 Tables confirmed this. A father could sell his son into slavery, though if he did so 3 times, the son was freed from his control. A father's power extended over property, marriage, and inheritance. These rules reinforced the patriarchal structure of Roman society, ensuring that family order was rigidly maintained. Property rights were another cornerstone of the code. The 12 Tables carefully defined boundaries, ownership, and disputes over land. If someone damaged another's crops, they were required to pay damages. If a person cut down a neighbor's trees, they were liable for compensation. The law even addressed the rights to water, a vital resource in agricultural Rome. These provisions reflected the importance of farming and land ownership in a city still dependent on its fields. Crimes were dealt with severely. Theft was punished harshly, particularly if committed at night. A thief caught in the act could be killed. If caught during the day, however, the thief could be handed over to the victim as a slave. Assault and injury were also addressed. If a man broke another's bone, he was required to pay a heavy fine, unless he was a slave, in which case the punishment was even harsher. One of the most chilling aspects of the 12 Tables was their approach to justice and punishment. The laws embraced the principle of retribution, the idea of an eye for an eye. If someone injured another, they could be subjected to the same injury in return, unless both parties agreed to a financial settlement. This principle, though brutal, was a step toward equality. Justice was no longer entirely at the discretion of the elite. The law applied the same rule to all citizens. The tables also contained laws that today may seem strange or outdated. For example, they prohibited excessive mourning at funerals, banning women from tearing their cheeks or wailing loudly. They regulated the cost of funerals, reflecting Rome's concern with order and practicality even in death. They even addressed witchcraft, forbidding spells that harmed crops or property. These rules remind us that the Romans lived in a world where superstition and ritual were intertwined with daily life. Yet for all their harshness, the 12 Tables also introduced important protections. They established the principle that no one could be punished without a trial. They recognized the right of appeal, allowing citizens to challenge decisions before the assemblies. They even laid the groundwork for equality under the law, stating that the same laws applied to patricians and plebeians alike. For a society emerging from bitter class conflict, this was revolutionary. The 12 Tables also marked a shift in power. By writing the law, the patricians lost their monopoly on legal knowledge. No longer could they manipulate custom for their own benefit. The plebeians, though still burdened by inequality, now had a weapon of their own. They could point to the tablets in the forum and demand justice according to what was written. This transparency was the beginning of accountability. In practice, the 12 Tables did not eliminate conflict between the classes. The struggle of the orders continued for generations. Plebeians still fought for access to higher offices, for intermarriage with patricians, and for relief from crushing debt. But the written law provided a foundation. It gave the plebeians a tool to use in their ongoing fight, and it reminded the patricians that their power was not absolute. The impact of the 12 Tables reached far beyond their immediate context. They set a precedent that law should be written, public, and binding. They became a reference point for later Roman law, from the great jurists of the Republic to the codifications of the emperors. Even when the original bronze tablets were lost, the spirit of the 12 Tables lived on in the Roman legal tradition. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, praised the 12 Tables as the source of all public and private law. For him, they were more valuable than the libraries of Greek philosophy, for they provided the foundation of Roman society. Other authors echoed this sentiment, recognizing that the code, though harsh and primitive, had created a sense of order that allowed Rome to grow. The 12 Tables also influenced later civilizations. As Rome expanded, its legal principles spread across the Mediterranean. Centuries later, when the Emperor Justinian codified Roman law in the 6th century CE, the spirit of the 12 Tables still lingered. Their legacy would even reach into the modern world, shaping the development of Western legal systems. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the 12 Tables is how ordinary they seem. They deal with property lines, funerals, theft, and debt. They reflect the concerns of everyday life in a small, agrarian city-state. And yet, from these ordinary rules came extraordinary influence. The 12 Tables taught Rome, and later the world, that the law must be written in public. They established that justice required visibility and consistency, not secrecy and privilege. The harshness of the code cannot be ignored. Debt slavery, patriarchal control, and brutal punishments remind us that Rome was not a society of fairness as we understand it today. But the importance of the 12 Tables lies not in their content, but in their principle. For the first time in Roman history, the law was no longer hidden. It was made visible, carved into bronze, and placed where all could see. This principle would endure, shaping the identity of Rome as a republic. It gave citizens a sense of shared rules, a common standard that bound rich and poor alike. It was a beginning, imperfect but essential, a first step on a long road toward justice. The 12 tables were born out of struggle, forged in the conflict between classes, and carried forward by the determination of the plebeians to claim their rights. They were a compromise, but a compromise that worked. For centuries, they stood as the foundation of Roman law, a symbol of the Republic's commitment to order, clarity, and equality under the law. And so, the story of the 12 tables reminds us of a truth that still resonates today. Justice cannot survive in secrecy. Law must be written, public, and shared by all. Rome's first code of law may have been harsh, but it was also a declaration of principle. It was a promise that the law belonged to the people, and that promise would shape the destiny of Rome.